again. So this is essay question number 2 for exam 1 questions video. The first thing that I need to explain to you is how the resting membrane potential is established. Now that is established through equilibrium between the intracellular fluid that has a bilipid layer protecting it and the extracellular fluid, which is usually water. Nor am I spelling. And resting membrane potential measures the equilibrium between the two. Now, what usually keeps those properties or characteristics of that in place that account for that would be channels. So we have ligand-gated channels, which use a sort of protein receptor to come in and open that gate up. We also have voltage-gated channels that require a charge, either positive or negative, to open up. We also have mechanical channels, which require either the compressing or the releasing of the membrane around it within the bilipid layer to be opened or closed. And then we also just have leak channels, which those are just open and closed as the bilipid layer sees fit. So it open and closes by telling if it needs more or less. So it'll release if it needs to release, and it'll let in if it needs to let in. So like a potassium channel, those ones are usually going out. Well, if we had like a sodium channel, that one would be bringing in, because there is more potassium within the ICF than there is in the ECF, and then with sodium there's more in the ECF than there is in the ICF. So if it needs to bring back that equilibrium so it has resting membrane potential, then it will open up and let it in or out, whichever ion is coming in or whichever ion is coming out. Now, what usually affects the resting membrane potential size is what we would consider as the size is, so I'm going to just pull out a graph real fast. With a graph, we have a threshold and usually a certain point where our body likes to maintain. So normally it's negative 70 millivolts, so it'll like to stay here. Now something that could change the size of a resting membrane potential, so this is resting membrane potential, something that can change the size is whatever we're allowing into the intracellular fluid. So something that, a common changer is calcium. So calcium can make our threshold go higher, or it can make it go lower. So calcium will affect threshold more than it will affect potential. So that's the one I mainly know, but it's whatever ions that come in that affect our threshold more than our resting membrane potential. That's what's going to change our size of what we have. Okay, and then you want a brief discussion of the Nernst equation and driving force. So Nernst equation is made up of many things, and what it is, so it'll be labeled EX, and it's negative 61.5, which is the constant derived from this equation, divided by Z times by log, that is the log of the ion's input, divided by the ion's output. And that is the equation for Nernst equation. Now, driving force is it's Vm minus inerts, and I believe Vm is voltage measured, and this is mainly whatever the body is sitting at most constantly. So more than not, it'll be -7 millivolts, because that's where we usually are, minus whatever we got from an equation. So an example would be is if we, so I'm gonna go down here. For our next equation, let's just use the resting membrane potential of potassium, which is an input of 140 and an output of 5. So if we were to plug that into the equation, it'd be -61.5 over z with the log of 140 over 5. And so 140 over 5, that becomes 28 times by the log of -61.5. So real fast, Z is valence electron, so it'll be +1 because potassium is +1. So this would become -61.5, and then where my phone? Oh, you are my phone. Okay. Give me just a sec. Alrighty, welcome back. I just decided to solve the rest of the problem. So where we left us off is -61.5 over the valence charge of +1 times by the log of 28, which gets us -61.5 times 1.447. Yep, 1.447, which gives us -89.002. And then if we were to put that into driving force, that would be -70 millivolts minus the negative of 89.002, which would give us an up charge of 19.02. So if we were to draw this on a graph, we would be sitting here at -70 millivolts, and then we'll just put this as 19, we'll just put it at 19 millivolts, and threshold's about here. So what that would mean is we would go from resting membrane potential into an action potential, up into, we hit 19 millivolts, and it'll cause it to go up, and then it'll go back down. So yeah, that's how that works. And then in part 2 of the essay, you're going to describe the events that take place during a typical action potential. And so let me just get one drawn real fast. Okay, so here's my best drawn graph. Probably need a little more light in here. Yeah, that works. Better light. Anyways, so my best drawn graph. Action potential. Woo! Alright, so let's label everything, shall we? So this is the initial stimulus. This is the thing that caused us to have an action potential. And so right about this point, so we have our potassium leak channels coming in. So our potassium leak channels are open. And though we are still at this, right at this point, we're just going to call it 1. This is the beginning, right before the threshold. Our sodium channels are not open. Now, when we pass the threshold, we are coming into the rise. So, potassium voltage gated channels. So, no, we're going to write it like this. So, the potassium voltage gated channels are closed. And sodium, why am I not writing right today? Goodness. Sodium voltage gated channels are now open. So they're open, the floodgates are beginning. So they're kind of drawn like this. And so there's a spiral in there, a little ball, and then opening gate. So this spring is triggered to go down usually and close this lid because there's a lot of positive on top and negative on bottom. Now, when potassium leak channels causes it to rise and open going past threshold, it starts taking away some of these. And it causes this and some of these as well, honestly. And causes them to, for this spring to release, opening that gate. So that's what's happening here. So that gate is now open and sodium is rushing in. Now, about this point, we're still kind of in the rise, but it's starting to slow down somewhat. I wonder all the turn. Okay, just double checking I have all the right turns real fast. Okay, yeah, so we're still in the rise, but what happens now is the sodium gated voltage gated channel is slightly closed now. So it's not completely closed, but it's slightly closed. And our potassium leak channels are still open, but our potassium voltage gated channels are still closed. But this is slightly closed, and we still have the leak channels happening here. So throughout this, you will still always have leak channels mostly going on. So these are open, which is going to cause this little peak to happen. But now this is now slightly closed. And what that means is this little ball and string kind of come up here. They swing up because there's not as much negative charge, and they block that entrance. So now this is blocked. Sodium is having a harder time getting through. There's something in its way now. Now we go to the fall. What happened here is now that our sodium channels have reached equilibrium, basically, they are now closed. But because this is equalized doesn't mean that the potassium is. So the potassium voltage gated channels are now open, along with the leak channels. But this is now closed. So now this is going to swing back into its proper place. But this, now that it's equalized, is going to close. Because now we have more charges down here. And now the spring is being compressed, and it closes that gate back again. So now it's closed, we're in the fall, we're going down. Now, with both of these channels open, that causes us to not only reach resting membrane potential, but actually to hyperpolarize. So about here, our potassium voltage gated channels are still slightly open, and our leak channels are open still. And until we reach about here, when we reach our resting membrane potential, is when our leak channels, our voltage gated channels close. And I believe our leak channels as well close because there's no longer a need for them. So what usually happens over here is this stimulus causes the leak channels to open, which then throws our body out. Now what's happening is, what our body does here is it's trying to depolarize And then once it's depolarized, it's not going to repolarize. But that can cause us to go into hyperpolarization because potassium goes out a lot faster until those gates are closed, and then we reach resting membrane potential. So that's how action potential works. This is a graded potential. And then refractory period. What happens in a refractory period is that there's an absolute and then there's a reflective. So the absolute is something that the body's going to do, and it's not going to go back and do it again. Like, it's not going to happen one on top of the other. This has to completely go through. So this part right here, sorry, that was a terrible line. This part right here in the middle has to completely finish all the way through till it's back in threshold before another one can start. The one right next to it is called a reflective refractory period. So it's just the body's response to the absolute refractory period on what's going on. So it's just like, hey, you know, you did this. I gotta kind of, it's gonna do this naturally. It's just part of the natural way because of how things flow. This is like, oh, you did that, so this is gonna have to happen. It's just reflective of our absolute. I think that is all on part 2 that I needed to talk about. Okay. Okay, and then, alrighty, so, capatins, the range is dependent on about how many separated charges you have. So, let's say if we had a high capatent, it would look something like this between a membrane, and that one's 4, and that's considered high to something that has, let's say, only 2 separated charges between a membrane. That's considered high. This has more than what this one does. This one's considered low capatance. So the more you have, the higher the capatance. The less you have, the lower capatance. It's very correlation-wise. Length constant is based on how strongly, I would say, how close those charges are together. So capatance counts how much are separated, while length constant depends on how far away the charges from each other. So this one has longer length than that one, and that one has longer length than that one. So it all depends on how spread apart it is. The more spread apart, the less effect it has, by what I recall. So the less effect it has really on that membrane, and the less useful it is. The closer they are together, the more charge you can kind of see and sense within the membrane. The farther they are apart, the distance becomes a lot harder, and it charges the ICF and the ECF just a little bit differently, if that makes sense. And how they react in myelin is kind of similar. So because of myelin gives a thicker bilipid layer. That is a terribly drawn layer, but we're going to pretend it's a good one. No, we're not, because it's going to drive me insane. So, bilipid layer. So because there's more thickness there because of myelin, because it adds extra to the bilipid layer, you're going to have lower capatance because it has a harder time getting ions through, so a lot less ions are permeable to a myelin sheath, and you're going to get a lot more distance because, again, it's thicker, so there's more space in between, which is going to lower length constant, and it's going to lower capatance. I think I'm saying that wrong. Well, we'll pretend I'm saying that right. So with myelin, that's how it will affect it, and that's how it will kind of change. Now, let's say if we had sodium. If we were to sodium into this mess, sodium can barely pass through a bilipid layer on its own, so trying to get it to go through will be really hard, and it'll take a lot of tries before it actually can pass through. And again, just lower time. Longer space, less amount going through. So that's the difference when it comes to myelin and stuff. I think that's everything I needed to talk about, so thank you for listening to my TED Talk.